I read Shari Franke's memoir, The House of My Mother. Shari Franke, if you're not familiar, is the oldest daughter of the family vlogging channel 8 Passengers, which was canceled, and then after that, the mom of that family was arrested for things I cannot say on YouTube without getting demonetized. This book does a really good job of just going chronologically through what actually happened, starting with her parents' meeting. So you should definitely buy the book to read it for yourself. What I hope to accomplish in this video is to share my own thoughts and takeaways about the many insights in this book as a doctor of clinical psychology. Specifically, I want to look at what Shari's perspective has to teach us about the experience of having a narcissistic mother, the experience of having a father who won't protect his children, the lack of systemic support for these children, the relationship between faith, cults, and abuses of power, and our incredible capability for resilience as human beings. So let's get started. So like I said, Shari Franke is the oldest daughter of the family vlogging channel 8 Passengers. This was run by Ruby Franke, a Mormon mother in Utah. And Shari Franke has spoken out before about the harms of involving minors in family vlogging. I actually did cover that in a separate video, so make sure to check that out as well. So I won't be focusing very much on that part today. But at some point in the channel, Ruby's very harsh parenting techniques started to become apparent in vlogs. People started to notice. They canceled her kind of in a similar way to how Nurse Hannah has been canceled recently. And the more she started to lose everything else, the more Ruby Franke became drawn to disgraced therapist turned life coach Jody Hildenbrand. And a few years ago, both Ruby and Jody were arrested for the mistreatment of the Franke children. This book does a wonderful job of showing the experience of having a narcissistic mother. Now, I want to preface this by saying, I don't know Ruby Franke. I've never treated her psychologically. If I did, it wouldn't be ethical for me to make this video. So I cannot speak to what mental health diagnoses Ruby Franke does or doesn't have. But Shari Franke in the memoir itself wrote that she believes her mom has narcissistic personality disorder. And I gotta tell you that based on the way Ruby Franke was described in the memoir, there were dozens upon dozens of moments where I did think to myself, this sounds very consistent with the psychology of narcissism. So before marriage, Shari writes that Ruby had these sort of grandiose visions of becoming a piano player. She said for her, playing wasn't about fun, it was about excelling. And when she fell short of perfection, it left a dent in her ego that no amount of practice seemed to fill. So we see here this very externally dependent self-esteem. Self-esteem that doesn't come from within, from things that you can control, but rather from what other people think of you. That is very quintessentially narcissistic. And then Shari said that when music didn't seem to define her mother's greatness, she decided motherhood would. Shari does a really good job of describing how narcissists treat their children as extensions of them. Blank slates, ready to be inscribed with her wisdom, her values, her rubiness. In her arms lay not just a baby, but a woman's ultimate power, her divine right to mold a new soul in her image. So for example, Shari spoke about how Ruby kind of forced piano onto the children, seemingly to kind of like live vicariously, but also to kind of force them to carry on what she loved. Because again, people with this particular personality style don't see their children as individual beings and separate beings. They see them as like a mini me. And so what that can often result in is children aren't allowed to do anything that differentiates or anything that makes it seem like they might be independent. Shari refers to it as molding obedience, sculpting compliance. For example, she was never allowed to cut her hair however she wanted. Self-expression was not allowed, like she wasn't even allowed to decide the color of her bedroom walls until she was 17. Shari also highlighted the emotional dysregulation and lack of empathy of her mother. For example, she said that Ruby Franke was one of those kids need to cry it out types of moms, which reflects such a lack of empathy of like when there's a baby in distress, how could you not care? But also that's how babies learn to regulate themselves, by being co-regulated at first with somebody else. And Shari said that Ruby herself cried a lot, but nobody else in the household was allowed to have feelings. And this is what caused Shari to start bottling up her feelings. Basically like a form of learned helplessness, of figuring out like, well, okay, if I don't have a right to share my feelings, express my feelings, then I'm just gonna become completely numb. In a sense, it's a survival strategy. But of course, Ruby had an issue with that as well, because when you're not very expressive and you're not very validating to somebody with narcissism, that can also be very triggering for them, and they might also lash out because of that. And in fact, Shari did describe that a lot of really small triggers would result in physical or verbal abuse. For instance, even one hint of displeasure on my face. She said Ruby was always angry with us, always on edge, primed to blow no matter how small the irritation. Shari also described what I would consider to be a lot of emotional abuse and manipulation techniques. For instance, she described Ruby just kind of like battering her self-esteem. For instance, there was one journal entry in which she described how her mom and dad pulled her into the room to basically tell her that all the issues she was having at school were her fault, that no one wanted to be around her, that she was no fun. At one point, Shari was seeing a therapist, and once Ruby started to see that the therapist was empowering Shari, she basically lied to Shari and told her that her therapist thinks she's making everything up, everything's fine, she doesn't need to go back. There were also mentions of emotional blackmail, fear, obligation, and guilt. Shari described that in the way her mom had a very transactional view of relationships, of saying things like, after all I've done for you. How she would often dole out love contingent on good behavior, whereas, parents are supposed to have the closest thing to unconditional love possible for their children. But for narcissistic parents, that is very much not the case. Love is very much conditional on obedience. Ruby Franke also threatened to decapitate her daughter's stuffed animal as punishment one time. Shari also describes her playing the victim a lot and just really vindictive punishments for disobedience, like not getting the kids Christmas presents, taking Shari off the family car insurance policy once she started to distance herself from the family, getting her son to sleep on a beanbag. Like at some point, these forms of very vindictive punishment, they veer into the territory of sadistic. I also saw what looked like instances of projection, of Ruby herself saying, Shari, you're the one who doesn't have empathy, you're not compassionate. As I'm reading this memoir, I'm like, it sure looks like Ruby's the one who doesn't have a lot of empathy for her children. And that's what narcissistic people do, they project a lot. All the ugliest behaviors that they take part in, they accuse the victims of doing. And the most quintessential example of projection is DARVO, deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. This is an abuse technique where basically someone who is the abuser accuses the victim of being the abuser. At one point, Ruby says, I can't take this abuse, during a fight with Shari. And then once Shari started to distance herself from Ruby, that was when she described almost like a smear campaign against her, of her mom turning her other family members against her because she was no longer obeying. And in the aftermath of being canceled on YouTube and also getting closer and closer to Jodi Hildebrandt, Ruby Franke began taking part in increasingly severe deprivation, neglect, and isolation of the children. So for instance, she got rid of the dog, presumably so that they wouldn't be seen around town walking the dog. She pulled the kids out of school, and she was planning on selling the house to move to somewhere remote where no one knew about them. And there didn't seem to be any accountability even after the arrest. She was claiming that Jodi was the one to blame when, as Shari pointed out, her behaviors were problematic long before she ever met Jodi. And she ended up writing Shari a quasi-apology where she said basically like, I should have spent more time with you before college. Which you'll find this again pretty often with abusers and with people who have narcissistic personalities, is that when they do apologize, it's for something very minor. And it's often something that's not really the core of the issue, because it's easier for them to take small responsibility than to admit the real vastness of the errors in their ways. Shari also really narrated how vlogging fueled her mother's narcissistic facade and persona. Because while she was vlogging, she could put on a front. She was using like her vlogging voice. And because everything was centered around that facade, it started to bleed into their personal lives. So for instance, no one was allowed to have anything other than plain decor in the household because it needed to look good for the cameras. Sacrificing the actual warmth of a home for the cleanness, the crispness of the facade. Shari also talks about how her mom would kind of objectify everyone in the family as if they were props in a movie, how she got a lot of validation from views and engagement at the expense of her family's well-being, because of course family vlogging is traumatic to children. And Shari talks about how people would send her these really parasocial comments saying like, wow, I feel so seen by you, I hope I can be such a great mom as you one day, when how incredibly ironic that if only they knew the truth about what was behind the facade, they would realize they don't actually know this person at all. A lot of Ruby's putting on this persona for the cameras really felt like a reaction formation. A reaction formation, as a reminder, is a defense mechanism in which certain traits or emotions or desires are denied by a person and overcompensated by exaggerating the direct opposite of them. Kind of positioning herself as an authority on ideal motherhood while at the same time being, legally speaking, unfit to be a mother. But Shari's memoir also shows us what happens when you have a father who won't protect his children. Her father, Kevin, she describes as laid back in contrast to Ruby's more intense spirit. She describes him as kind of like easily controlled and guided. And this makes sense to me. I don't know if you guys have ever noticed, but oftentimes like the meanest people end up with the sweetest, nicest people who would never hurt a fly because you kind of have to, when you're that mean, most people are going to give you pushback. So the only type of person that you can really end up with long term is someone who lets you do whatever you want and enables you. And I'm sure it was somewhat of a protective factor that Shari had at least one parent who was kind to her. But there were points throughout the memoir where I did kind of feel like she was maybe making excuses for her dad a little bit. Because letting your children get mistreated to that extent is equally as damaging as being the one doing the mistreating. And even after Ruby was arrested, Kevin was concerned for her and he was saying I love my wife, I want her to be okay, even after finding out what she did to his children. I think sometimes when you have an abusive parent and a non-abusive parent, it can be so tempting to devalue the abusive parent and to idealize the one who's not abusive. But if that parent is not protecting you the way that a parent is responsible to do, they are in no position to be idealized. They are in no position for you to be making excuses for them. Shari's memoir also teaches us so much about the relationship between faith, cults, and abuses of power. Firstly, she really shows how motherhood can be for some people a way of gaining spiritual, cultish levels of power over the family system. Shari refers to Ruby as the self-anointed saint of motherhood. She says, "Becoming a mother in my faith is a spiritual calling of the highest order, a chance to emulate the divine and participate in the grand tapestry of creation." She talks about how family is one of the cornerstones of Mormonism. And I think this is true for a lot of different religious faiths. Perpetuating the family is seen almost like kind of doing God's work. Just like God created humans, presumably, humans then have the capability of creating more humans, which kind of parallels the divine creation and establishes that person almost as a mini God in a sense. Shari talks about how she has a recurrent dream in which God's voice is booming down at her saying, "You were wrong to defy your mother," which really speaks to this connection between the power of God and the almost godlike power of an abusive mother. Something else that I found really fascinating was after Shari created her own YouTube channel as a teenager, her mom started to take 10% of her YouTube revenue as a management fee. And I thought it was so interesting that 10% is what people give to churches for tithing. Is that not the most symbolic sign that Ruby kind of saw herself as God? That she thought her daughter should be tithing to her. And of course, Ruby did what many abusive parents do, which is comparing her suffering to Christ on the cross. It's very common how abusers will weaponize faith in order to use against their victims, and also God and prophet complexes are super common in narcissism. There's a very interesting link between weaponizing religion and abusive parenting. Because religion is often used to justify abusive parenting. It's often used to say you can't disobey your parents can do no wrong, you have to accept them all the time. And also certain depictions of God behave very similarly to an abusive parent. It's really fascinating, the connection between these two. Now, something else on this topic is that Shari refers to Jody Hildenbrand as our family's very own cult leader. So Jody Hildenbrand was a licensed mental health counselor who had her license revoked for violating patient confidentiality while she was accusing one of her clients of being an abuser with no evidence. And she's definitely described as having a similar sort of prophet complex of herself. Jody's philosophy is apparently honesty, personal responsibility, and vulnerable humility. And all of these are incredibly ironic. They're more examples of what I refer to as reaction formation. When you are trying to show yourself as being the exact opposite of what you really are. For example, honesty. She's constantly preaching honesty, yet according to Shari, she was living a lie. She was actually gay while she was preaching all this homophobic stuff. Personal responsibility. Shari describes how Jody never thought she was to blame for anything. Her kids wanting nothing to do with her business falling apart. She was always the victim, always the martyr. Humility. Jody was charging insane prices. She saw herself as almost like a kind of prophet. She would batter the self-esteem of people who already struggled with scrupulosity issues. She would put on this guise of wanting to help people when really it was just to be cruel. Nothing humble about it. Also, Jody was always preaching about cognitive distortions, but she would gaslight Shari, which is like the ultimate cognitive distortion. Shari spoke about how at some point her mom said to her, anyone who doesn't like Jody is hiding something. It means you're threatened by the truth she speaks. So making her sound like infallible, what does that sound like? Like she's maybe a prophet, maybe a god? And when Jody found out that Shari didn't like her, she got Ruby to bring her to therapy too, where she confronted Shari for spreading lies and rumors and gossip about her and basically tried to break her into compliance. She basically drilled into Shari that she needs to do this incredibly harmful intervention of self-denigrating constantly. She would tell her, think to yourself, oh my gosh, I'm going to fail this test because I'm a very stupid little girl. Or, Shari, be humble, you are far less clever than you think they are. The only people who would ever encourage you to self-abuse, to verbally abuse yourself, are the people who have something to gain from you not having self-esteem. Be very careful about anyone that's telling you to speak horribly about yourself. And ironically, in this attempt to make Shari more humble, she ended up making her more self-righteous because Shari would go around school talking about how everyone else is operating on cognitive distortions except for her. Everything got twisted under Jody's interventions. Everything got turned into its opposite. Shari also talked about how Jody seemed to specialize in getting husbands out of the picture, and she got Ruby to also cut off her entire family in addition to her husband. Isolation and control are two key components of both an abuser and a cult leader. And in fact, that is why oftentimes cult leaders are abusers with narcissistic personalities. Now, once Jody's own facade fell apart, that's when things started to get really bad in the home. That's when things really started to escalate. And I think this really shows that you do not want to be in the vicinity of a narcissist or an abuser when they're losing everything. That can be extremely dangerous. So in the end, why was Ruby so drawn to Jody? This was the part that I wasn't 100% sure on. Did she have romantic feelings for Jody because, as Shari says, they ended up having a romantic relationship? Did she find a source of self-esteem in doing the kind of coaching that Jody was promoting? Was she bamboozled by a cult leader, or was she drawn to a cult leader because she herself was the cult leader in her own family? But something else on this topic of religion and cults and abuse is that Shari talks about her experience of being groomed by a man high up in the church as a later teen. And basically this man weaponized his religious power, and he identified her as vulnerable because of her family situation. He was the only person who validated Shari that what her mom was doing was messed up, and he claimed that he was beyond reproach because of his involvement in the priesthood. So again, this like weaponization of religion. And when Shari opened up to the church about this, she was the one who was punished for it. And he originally went off scot-free. No consequences whatsoever. I mean, like, think, what is the message you're trying to send when you punish the victim, but not the aggressor? If that's not victim blaming, what is? But I think that this experience really shows how when a person coerces and controls their children, it ironically sets up those children for a lifetime of future relationships in that vein. Because now not only are they vulnerable to people who would abuse that vulnerability, but now they're also not quite sure to recognize those behaviors as abusive because those behaviors occurred in their own family by the people that were supposed to love and protect them. So if they see somebody else outside the family taking part in those same behaviors, they're going to think, this is normal, this is love, this is protection. Shari also mentioned at one point that Ruby became obsessed with West Point Military Academy and started emulating their forms of punishment for the children. And again, I thought this was interesting because what do religion, the military, and authoritarian parenting all have in common? They all have the capability to abuse their power. Now, Shari talks about how her faith is a source of strength for her. How, for instance, when she got baptized, it was a sense of safety and security and warmth. And how these days, she uses her faith almost as kind of like a moral compass, where instead of people saying like, I'm high up in the church, you should listen to me, she checks in with herself and her own, what she calls conversations with God. I think it's wonderful that she managed to find strength in her spirituality, because something that I sometimes see with people who are ex-Mormon, for instance, or who flee cults, is they'll talk about being like deprogrammed from those belief systems. But when you actually look at the behaviors they're taking part in, they're quite literally not. For instance, I've known people who were previously Mormon and very rigid about their beliefs and thought that everyone who didn't ascribe to their particular belief was going to hell and all that. And then after they drifted away from Mormonism, they kept that same rigidity. They kept that same self-righteousness and now just applied it to the opposite side. So they would now start to, for instance, make fun of everyone who wasn't an atheist. It's like, you think you're deprogrammed. You think that because you no longer believe this, that you're an ex-Mormon. But you're not deprogrammed, because you're still operating on the same exact cognitive rigidity and self-righteousness as before you were, quote unquote, deprogrammed. So again, I'm really happy that Shari managed to find a sense of temperance and strength in her own spirituality. Her memoir also really highlighted the lack of systemic support for mistreated children. She talks about how DCFS was called multiple times to no avail, that neglect was too difficult to prove in Utah because of something called free-range parenting laws, which I'd actually heard of free-range parenting laws as kind of being praised as a good thing for like people being less controlling with their children. But Shari talks about how these laws can sometimes be used in the state of Utah to make it really hard to investigate and prove cases of neglect. And there was one thing Shari said that like really, really hit me on a deep level. She said, I wished I could have walked out that door and never come back. But the cold truth was I had nowhere to walk to. I mean, I got shivers when I read this, because I think this is the experience of so many mistreated children. They yearn for escape, but there's nowhere to escape to because there are no systemic supports for them. And abusers will often tell their victims, no one will love you like I do, no one has your best interests in heart like I do. But the irony is that by isolating their victims, that actually becomes a reality. It's not even a lie anymore. The victim no longer has anywhere to turn to. And those abusive things that the abuser is telling them, they become true. And sometimes even harder than the abuse itself is the fact that there's no one who seems to be able to help. But I think Shari's memoir also shows how much of a protective factor it can be to have at least some adults in your life who are kind, who are caring and well-intentioned, whether it was her dad, her neighbors, her aunts and grandparents. Studies do show that when children have at least one positive figure in their life, even amid really terrible life circumstances, they're far more likely to come out on the other side okay. In terms of the effects of this upbringing that Shari spoke to, we saw somatization. Like sometimes children will, when they're dealing with high amounts of stress, have tummy issues or have like physical issues that come up that have no organic cause, because they don't even have like the language to explain what's wrong oftentimes. She talked about emotionally shutting down. She talked about rebelliousness in some parts, which for her meant like kissing a lot of boys for a period of time. I think there are far more rebellious things she could have been doing, but rebelliousness is often a byproduct of being abused because it's an overcorrection from being over-controlled. And like sometimes parents try to be really strict and over-controlling with their children without realizing that it backfires. That like if they could just have a little bit of moderation from the get-go, the children themselves would be a lot more moderated. So there were periods of time when Shari was rebellious, but there were also periods of time when she was very conforming. And she was using a lot of the fawn response, which is like, instead of fight, flight, or freeze, when you start to like coax your abuser's self-esteem as a way of surviving. She also described anxiety and panic attacks, scrupulosity obsessions, which are these like self-flagellating, guilty thoughts, this like constant monitoring of your own thoughts and actions to make sure that you're moral. She disclosed that she was struggling with depression for a while, with thoughts of SI, and of course how Those harmful relationships became a repetition compulsion. With the man who groomed her, she was heading back into the same type of relationship because psychologically, we try to do it over. We try to get it right this time. But also Shari's story, I think, really speaks to her remarkable resilience. I could tell pretty early on that Shari has had a lot of therapy. When I read the sentence, I can't help but feel sadness for the baby girl who cried for her mother, meaning herself. She seems really in touch with feelings of grief, which is crucial to healing. You have to be in touch with what you've lost in order to move forward. And a lot of the symptoms that I just mentioned she developed, they weren't just symptoms, they weren't just pathological. A lot of them were also survival mechanisms and signs of resilience. Like emotionally shutting down or the fawn response, all of these at some point kept her safe, I'm assuming. And Shari herself talked about how she found herself being drawn to stories of resilience from history. Of course she would. If you were needing to be resilient, of course you would be drawn to other stories of resilience. There just seems to be something in Shari that makes her very strong. For example, once she realized that Jody was gaslighting her, she said, "I became hypervigilant, less focused on finding evidence of my own distorted thinking than on monitoring hers. I zeroed in on the ways in which she didn't play by her rules." That's so badass for a teenager to do. That's not something that all teenagers are capable of. That's incredibly resilient. And in the end, she used the platform, the audience that ruined her childhood, as a source of strength instead to publish this book, to tell her own story in her own words. If that's not resilience, what is? So, again, I would really encourage you to buy this book, to read it for yourself, and let me know what you think of it. Thank you so much to Shari Franke for sharing her story. I'm sure it's helping a lot of other victims out there, and I hope you have a nice rest of your week.